Equality, diversity and inclusion in digital learning. Decolonisation. 20 minutes with Andy McLellan, Head of Public Engagement and Programmes at Pitt Rivers Museum, University of Oxford. Who are you and where do you work?
I'm Andy McLellan and I'm Head of Public Engagement and Programming at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford.
What does decolonisation mean to you?
Decolonisation means quite a lot of things, I think, and it's something we need to unpack, and different people see it in different ways, but I think slowly we are building up a kind of shared awareness or knowledge of what decolonisation is. And basically, I think as far as my work in an ethnographic museum goes, decolonisation is about moving power structures. And I think that's the definition that overrides all others. And those power structures are many. And on one level, you've got within decolonisation at the history of British colonialism and the stories we tell and the ways in which we might tell them. And that's quite important that we do that. Pitt Rivers is a museum that has, that is very closely tied to British colonial history, and those stories haven't necessarily been told. But if we're looking at changing power structures, what decolonisation really is, it's about who tells those stories, whose voices we hear, and where the equality and parity is within that. So a good example of that kind of decolonial work might be how we have worked with the Haida over the last 20 years. So Haida are totem pole makers from the northwest coast of Canada, we had a curator who had very strong ties to the Haida. So back in the early 2000s, the museum started consulting Haida about labels. So that's a really important part of decolonisation, is to get the stories of lived experience in. In 2009, a lot of Haida came over to ask for some human remains to be returned, which they were, and this created relationships, because we can't go back and change history. We can only be responsible for the part of history that we are involved in. So having those conversations. But what we moved to in recent years is who gets paid for their professionalism. So the Haida in the past did it as volunteers because they wanted to see their voices in the museum. But if the Haida weren't being paid and curators are being paid, then that is an unfair power structure, and that is not decolonial practice. So it's really important that when we're working with people with lived experience, that they are paid professionally for that. And we extend that into other work. So we've been working on Multuck at Oxford, which is working mainly with forced migrant communities and bringing them in to interpret museum collections. Some of them are involved because they need to improve their English so they can get jobs, and that's appropriate to be volunteers. But we had one person who had been a social worker in Syria before she came to the UK and had worked with Iraqi refugees in Syria, and that was professional skills that we needed to pay for. So it's that awareness that we need to bring in different voices, but we also need to be treated in the same way that we get treated, that we get paid to go to work and other people need to as well. I think we're also looking at this very broadly. So with decolonisation, that you're looking at who is represented in the museum. So a real decolonial museum should be a museum where anyone who walks into the museum sees themselves represented in that space. And something we've been working on a lot over the last couple of years is about queering the collection, working with LGBT communities. So in the past, we said, how many queer people are there in the world? Well, as far as the Pitt Rivers is concerned, there wouldn't be any, because there were no queer voices in the museum. So decolonisation isn't just about empire, it is about power structures and whose voices get heard, and making sure that people recognise themselves in the museum.
How do you and your team embed a decolonial approach to digital provision or ways of working?
First of all, it's about participatory practice. It's about co-production. So our recent exhibition, Beyond the Binary, was co-curated with members of the LGBT community, both internationally, nationally and locally, and that's really important. Co-production is really time-consuming, and it's not the easiest option, and it's not the easiest option for collections or conservators, but it's really important if those voices are going to be represented. So we have to embed it through that kind of approach. At the moment, we're looking at how to decolonize family programming. I think it's easy to see how formal learning or some of our digital engagement, where we've been running Radical Hope digital events for the last couple of years, it's easy to see how that decolonial work happens, but with family practice, which is, you know, bread and butter of what people like me do in museums, is much more difficult to get lived experience voices. So we're trying to, again, that means you've got to have money to pay community connectors. So that's people in our local or international communities that know people. We pay them to connect us to communities. And this is at the moment around play and games. But once we've been connected to communities, we then need to also pay that community member for their voice to be recorded. So there's these multiple layers of embedding the approach within kind of participatory practice. The other thing about embedding decolonialism is we got to do it long term. One of the problems with museums is we run on this cycle, these short-term funding cycles, where we get funding for a project, we do it, we evaluate it, we move on to the next thing. For a lot of our communities, that feels like they're being dropped at the end of that. Oh, we've got no money left. Sorry, guys, we'll see you again if we get some money in the future. We have to find ways of sustaining those relationships. Otherwise, we build trust with people who might not be trusting of us, whether that's because we've got collections that were stolen from their originating community, or because people are not treated equally in society, like transgender people or other queer people. And so we have to sustain those long term. So at the moment, we're running out of money on querying the collections. We have to find ways of sustaining that within our core function and core delivery while we apply for more funding. So we can't change the funding cycle that happens in museums, but we can predict it.
How can you use digital to create new perspectives and voices on an equal footing with analogue interpretation?
I think when people come to a museum, particularly in formal learning groups, or maybe in informal groups as well, when they come to a museum like the Pitt Rivers, what they want is objects. They want collections. They want object handling. They want interaction. You can make films of Maasai people in Kenya talking about Maasai material culture, but people want to sit down and watch that in a museum. I'm not so sure. We're experimenting with different ways so that when we're playing games in the museum, we might have some film available so that people can watch it. And I think that's kind of facilitated by volunteers and members of staff, and perhaps delivered through iPad. So there is a kind of personal element rather than just saying to people, here's a link to it, go and watch it on YouTube if you feel so inclined. So I think we're going to experiment over the next few years. We know that there's quite a lot of, people are digitally tired after so long in COVID. And, we know that if we just put out digital content, that people, at the moment in particular, people aren't looking at it. So we need to find ways of having a hook to go with that. So we're looking with our Radical Hope program, which is online panel discussions around really important issues around decolonisation, which were really successful during lockdown, whether that's about returning Benin bronzes to Benin, or whether it's talking about different ways of looking at gender and sexuality in different parts of the world, or the many different ways of being. We had an event where we brought in an Evenki, an artist from St. Petersburg. So the Evenki are a minority group in central Siberia, and there was an artist supposed to come over. Obviously, with the current situation in the Ukraine, that wasn't possible. But we had a live feed where she talked, and she was talking about the many ways of knowing knowledge and the museum about. So I think there's something about decolonisation that often in museums we think that ultimately the way to see the world is the way I see it as a white European, whereas actually there are many ways of knowing, and those need to be expressed in the museum. And she was talking about that all animals and all human beings are the same, because every animal, every human being has a soul, and therefore the soul is exactly the same. So humans and animals are the same, and therefore they should be represented in that way in the museum, which isn't a very Eurocentric way of looking at things. So I think we can use digital provision to bring in people that otherwise maybe won't be present in the museum, and we might bring them in live, talk about the different ways of knowing knowledge. We've done the same thing with the Haida, where they think that objects should be used before they go into museums, because without being used, the objects aren't alive, and it's really important that the objects are alive. So we're working with Guaidenshaw, a Haida carver at the moment, to make a Haida game. I think it's a little bit like a Haida Monopoly, and he wants us to play the game. He wants it to be played in Haida Gwaii, and he wants it to be played in the UK before it becomes a museum object. So I think there's the way we can experiment with bringing in live digital voices to help us understand different ways of seeing the world. I think that's a really important part of what we're going to be doing over the next couple of years.
What tips would you give other cultural organisations and professionals looking to tackle these issues?
I think beginning to think about decolonisation is a difficult journey, and it's a difficult journey because it's hard. It's a difficult journey because there may be feelings of guilt involved, or feelings of being made to feel like you should feel guilty when actually you don't. So I think there's a lot of barriers that stop us from getting going. Once you get going, I can say from the experience that we've had at the Pitt Rivers over the last couple of years that it's a very exciting ride. And actually, we're in a moment of incredible change in the UK in museums and in the way we see our history, and to be a part of that journey and help decide the direction that of travel within that journey is a really amazing opportunity, whatever museum you work in. And you can only be in the conversation if you're in the conversation. Now, I think there's one of the things we did in lockdown 1, which was really useful for all of us, was a lot of training. And that training didn't have a cost to it. It was about watching short videos online. And again, getting people's experiences, which are different than mine, who are trying to explain those concepts that we are struggling with, but explaining from a slightly different angle. So I think there's a lot of stuff out there, and it's being trawled by all sorts of organisations that we're all involved with, whether that's the Oxford museums themselves and the resources that we have suggested staff should look at, or the Group for Education in Museums, or Kids in Museums. So many of our kind of umbrella support organisations have been looking at and thinking about decolonisation over the last couple of years. So I think there's some really important training aspects to do to understand the complexities of what this thing is, so that we're looking at it in a nuanced way, because the power of museums is to look at history in a nuanced way, to see how it, it's not the basics that you might or might not look at in school. It's getting down into stories that help us to understand the many layers of our history. So I think just getting out there and getting out there with other people is a really important thing. I went to a talk a couple of years ago by a curator at a museum in Austria, and they were talking about decolonisation in, I forget what the museum is now, but an Austrian museum. And there was a lot of people who were saying, but Austria never had an empire. There's no, it's probably got the smallest colonial footprint of any European country. And at some point it was a colonized country itself. But their argument was that as Europeans, we are incredibly wealthy in comparison to the rest of the world. And that wealth is built on European colonial history. So all Europeans have benefited from colonialism, and the wealth that I experienced, even though I'm not personally responsible for it. So I think looking at how all of our collections, whatever they are, do have an ability to look at decolonisation. So, for example, people say, well, natural history collections, you could never look at decolonisation with natural history collections. But of course, if we think about the many ways of understanding knowledge and the way Indigenous people around the world have managed their environment, there's an awful lot of things for us to learn out there. Because if we remember again, decolonisation is about power structures, about whose voices are there and whose voices get heard, and who's allowed to speak and who's not allowed to speak. So I think whatever our collections, there are ways into those discussions. Most museums will have some small ethnographic element to them, but it might be looking at power structures within our own culture and our own society. If we're looking at decolonisation as voices, and queering the museum as thinking about that there aren't black and white stories, I kind of think of some of our social history collections, like the Slug on a Thorn from Oxford, which cures warts. And someone in the past has written a label for that object which defines how it works. You get a slug, you rub it on a wart, you pierce the slug onto a thorn, the slug dies, your wart disappears. But when I told that story to people from the area that it comes from, some people said, hold on, it's not a slug, it's a bit of bacon. And someone else said, but you bury it in the garden. Because these are oral traditions with multiple layers of stories, and those stories can be told in many different ways. And as museums, if we tell one story, then that story becomes the definition of the object, and it's defined by the curator who's written it. Whoever they are, they only have a single background. So it's really important we have multiple voices in there, because the multiple voices will tell us the different stories and the ways you can look at objects. And that is a decolonial approach. whatever your collections are about. For example, we have a shadow puppet from Indonesia of Rama on display. It's very interesting. Indonesian shadow puppets, they used to tell great Hindu epic stories like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, but they're made in Indonesia, in Java, which is the most populous Muslim country in the world. So you've immediately got this change in power structures that shows that there isn't maybe the same polarization. We recently put a puppet on display whose labour has been written by a community member. So the puppet is Sri Kandi. In the Mahabharata, Sri Kandi is man, then woman, then man again. So it maybe shows different ways, non-European ways of looking at gender in the past through the Mahabharata, where maybe gender is more fluid. The Sri Kandi puppet is also used in contemporary Indonesia as to represent transgender rights. So it has a contemporary story to tell as well. So what we need to do is find out what are these multiple stories, and we as individuals can't know the full extent of those multiple stories. We have to go and find people that do know and who can tell us and who can bring something to the table that is different than our own view, whether that's because they're a woman when I'm a man, whether that's because they're from Asia instead of Europe. You know, there's all these different things to think about in relation to whatever collections people have.
Thanks, Andy. If you'd like to delve more into this topic of decolonisation and chat to Andy himself, why not join our monthly DLNET chat on Twitter this Friday, 1st July, 1 to 2 p.m. See you there.